The gospel reading this morning comes from the book of Mark, the 9th chapter, starting with the 2nd verse. Listen now to this word from the Lord. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud came a voice, "This is my Son, the Beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In the midst of getting ready for Valentine's Day, which happens to be Wednesday this week, which also happens to be Ash Wednesday this week, and so that's your hint that if you haven't started thinking about Valentine's Day, you better start now. If you haven't already thought about it, but you have thought about Ash Wednesday perhaps, then you know that as you are preparing for that, and we are preparing for that ourselves in my home, the church is preparing for the beginning of Lent. Lent is those 40 days before Easter Sunday, and those 40 days don't include the Sundays during that season because Sunday is Little Easter. And so that is the day when we celebrate the risen Christ, no matter what season of the year or what season the church happens to be in during the year. Every Sunday is Little Easter. As we prepare for that Sunday, though, for that coming Sunday, when we talk about Christ being risen from the dead, we start the season with a reminder about who Jesus really is. Jesus was not really just a good man who did good things. He wasn't just someone who modeled the ways of God for people to see and to experience for themselves. On this Sunday, the Sunday that we call Transfiguration Sunday, we are reminded that Jesus is also divine, that he is the Son of God, the one who the prophets spoke about before he was born, the one who would come to show us what God in the flesh looks like, the one who would ultimately save us from our sins. So as Jesus takes those 3 disciples up the mountain, they have already been with Jesus for about 2 years. And they're used to following Jesus at this point and going wherever he went. And so this for them might have been like any other day. Except that when they get to the top of the mountain, things no longer make sense to them. They get up there and suddenly they see Jesus speaking to Moses, the giver of the law, and to Elijah, the great prophet. And we have no way of knowing whether or not they heard any of that conversation. There's no way for any of us to know what Jesus and Moses and Elijah had to say to one another. But then this cloud descends, according to Mark. It descends upon all of them there, and they hear the voice of God speaking to them. Words that they might not have heard, but were familiar in the baptism of Jesus. "This is my Son, the Beloved." But then there's this extra piece at the end. Listen. Listen to him. And then suddenly, the prophet and the giver of the law are gone, the cloud disappears, and they are left. Just the 3 disciples and Jesus. Now, This is a strange story, and most of the time we wonder what to do with the strange stories. Over my time in ministry, I've learned that there are just some things that are mystery, and they need to remain just what they are. They need to remain a mystery. Because after all, that's what our faith calls us to live into the idea that we are not ever going to have all the answers. But that's not how human beings choose to operate most of the time. Isn't it true that we want the answers to all of our questions? That we like the fact that we have enough collective brain resources that we can look for the answers to most of our questions, to most of the things that used to be mystery, and make them very accessible to us. So they are neat and tidy, and we can explain all things that are going on around us. But that's not what this story tells us. As a matter of fact, what this story tells us is that nobody really understands what's happening here. The disciples who had already walked with Jesus didn't know what to make of this story. It says that they were terrified. And so what do we do when we're terrified and when we want answers? We try to make sense of what's happened around us. And so Peter does what I think any of us would do. Jesus, let's stay on this mountain because it's a good place for us to be. And since we're all going to be here together, I'm going to make 3 little shacks or monuments, depending on how you understand that scripture or what version you would normally read it in. I'm going to build us 3 places, one for Moses, the lawgiver, one for Elijah the prophet, and even one for you. Because if I can get all 3 of you into your little boxes, I can figure out what happened here, and I can control the message. And once I have figured out what's going on here, we can invite other people up here on a pilgrimage. And they can come up here and we can control what they learn and what they know, and we will have it all figured out. Neat and safe. For a lot of people, that's how we like our faith. Neat and safe. And so let's build 3 boxes, and we can stay up on this mountain. The problem with that is that by this point in the gospel, neat and safe no longer apply. You see, just before Jesus takes these 3 disciples up the side of the mountain, Jesus has told them that he is going to take them to Jerusalem, where he will be arrested and tried and convicted and crucified. There is nothing neat and safe about crucifixion. And then he goes on to tell them, and everybody who is around that can hear, that if they want to be his followers, what they need to do is to pick up their cross and follow him, to walk toward their own death. He even goes on to say that if you want to save your life, you must lose your life for the sake of others. What does that mean? When everything that we have come to understand suddenly is shattered right before us. When the neat and the safe that we have learned to embrace, when the comfortable that we have learned to embrace no longer applies in our lives. I wondered how those disciples who had already left everything to follow Jesus heard that information. Did they think it was good news? After all, they had already left their friends and their families and their jobs to follow this itinerant preacher who they believed was going to overthrow the Jewish oppressors. At that point in time, it was the Romans, but it could have been anybody. They just believed that he was coming to put the Jewish people back in control of the land that God had promised them. And suddenly, they were faced with crucifixion. How do we hear the good news when we are presented with death, with destruction, with darkness and brokenness? Is it even possible for us to hear the voice of God speaking to us when we are facing the death of a loved one, or the loss of a job, the death of a relationship, the end of a dream? Do we hear the good news in those places? I remember many years ago when my father faced the final months of his life. I was already serving as a pastor in a local church, and I did the things that local pastors do. I went to my office every day. I preached the gospel on Sunday morning. I taught Bible study. I counseled people. And I wondered most of the time in those days if God could really hear the prayers of a broken-hearted man and his daughter. Is there good news when we're facing the end of something? While I was in my office one day, I received an email from a man that I had worked with on a city board. We were both on the youth advisory board in the city that we were in, and he had sent me an email. I just assumed it was about the things that we shared in common about the board. I thought for sure it had to be about the next meeting. And when I opened up that email, it was not what I expected. His wife of 37 years had served him with divorce papers. As I read that email, I wondered, why aren't you emailing your own pastor about this? I mean, the truth is I did not want to help one more person. I mean, he knew that I was hurting. And I was annoyed, if the truth be told. But when I got finished reading his email, I picked up the phone and I called him, and we had this interesting conversation on the phone. He said to me at one point, "There's part of me that wishes that she had died, because then I would not have to see her in the grocery store." I understood the pain and the gravity of what he was saying. And so I said to him on the phone, "I am so sorry." And as we hung up, before we did that, we prayed, and I thought about that for a long time afterward, and somewhere in the back of my head, I heard these words: "I lift my eyes to the hills. From where does my strength come from? My strength comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth." Those are the first two verses of Psalm 121. It is a psalm that I had used as a mantra in years previous as John and I struggled to raise our children. And so I opened up his email and I emailed him and I said, there's this psalm. And it would be really great for you to open up the Psalms and to start praying the Psalms and meditating on these things, because in the Psalms, you know that there is chaos and peace. There is life and death. There is all of our humanity spilled over the pages. And I thought to myself, why am I not listening to my own advice? But I didn't, and I just couldn't. Until a few weeks later when he called me and he said to me, I've been doing what you told me to do. I've been praying these Psalms. I've read all the Psalms, and I just keep praying through the Psalms every single day. And sooner or later, one day I woke up and I thought, I have a God who loves me with an everlasting love. I might be walking through the valley of the shadow of death, but God goes with me. I am God's child. And I remembered this passion I had for helping people who were hungry. And so he said to me, and I'll never forget this because he was so exact with this, every Saturday morning I get up at 4 a.m. and I drive to Dallas. It takes me 34 minutes. And I go to a soup kitchen and I help them set up for the people that will be coming in, and then I come home. He said, I love doing that. You see, he had heard this whisper in his ear, this whisper of death that told him that he no longer had value, that because he had failed his wife, he had failed at life, because he was no longer part of a couple, that he was incomplete, that he would be alone and lonely. But then he heard this voice of life that said, you are my beloved, and I love you with an everlasting love, and I knit you together in your mother's womb, and all that I have is yours. And that's the voice he chose to listen to. And so he picked up his cross, and he was never more alive than in those moments. He shared his mountaintop experience with me as I walked in the valley. And I remembered that I was not alone, and that God was still working in me and through me. And in those moments, I made a choice to listen to that other voice, the voice that gave me life. We all have a choice as to what voice and whose voice we will listen to each and every day. But that doesn't mean we will only hear the voice when things are good. And as a matter of fact, it often happens that when we are at our most broken and in our most pain, that voice opens us up to new possibilities for ministry and service to those who are all around us. We are not called to neat and safe in our faith. It might be what we want, but it's certainly not what we have received. Jesus did not live a neat and safe life. He modeled for us courage and humility and strength, even in his brokenness. It was his broken heart that pours itself out in love for us. That's the voice of the one we should listen to. I remember my very dear friend from grade school calling me. We were both in college. I was living in New York. She was living in the South, and she called me. She had gotten married, and she had an infant and a child that was barely 2 years old. And her husband just left. Just left. And if that wasn't bad enough, what she called me to tell me was she had no idea what she was going to do with these 2 boys that she had. Because you see, they were multi-ethnic children. And she didn't know culturally what to do with multi-ethnic children. And I didn't know what to do with children at all because I had none, and that wasn't even in my short-term vision at that point. And so we talked about that, and we talked about, her prayers. And to be honest, I wasn't praying because I wasn't even going to church. I didn't have a pastor. I didn't know what that looked like, but she did. And so she told me she would go talk to her pastor, and I said, well, I think that's a great idea. I wasn't really sure about that. But she went, and she called me every day, and one day she called me up and she said to me, my pastor is sending people over here. And I'm thinking, you're letting strangers in your home with 2 little boys. Over the course of those years, that pastor didn't send one man to help with her boys. He sent a church community to help with those boys. There were men that were pouring into the lives of those boys in ways that she could not have done on her own. They exhibited courage and humility and strength. They showed up at school events. They showed up at sporting events. They helped with homework. They helped with life. Every now and then they helped with a word or two of discipline. But they always showed up. These men and women who had received this gift on the top of a mountain made their way down and poured into the life of these two boys who are now grown men. And they reminded those boys that even if they didn't know their biological father, they had sacred value and worth, and they could be whoever they chose to be if they listened to the right voices. And they did, and they are. You know, we hear a lot about these 15 to 30-year-olds that are no longer showing up at church, that have no faith, that are now called the nuns or the duns. And we've also heard Don talk about, even as recently as 2 weeks ago, about what happens in some of their lives with the rise of addiction and the rise of suicide, with these overstressed people who are now trying to overcome that on their own and in isolation, and what that leads to. But what if we, the people of God, took our responsibility to pour into others seriously? What if we decided that we weren't going to judge and give up and be neat and safe within the walls of our churches, but said, I'm going to listen. I'm going to listen to people that are not exactly like me and are of a different generation than I am. And I'm just going to be present. I'm going to offer some mentoring or some coaching. I'm going to be the person that perhaps transfigures the reality that they are living in, so that they never wonder about their own sacred value and sacred worth. What if we offered a word about their being is not about their performing, because they are children of God? It would take courage and strength and humility. But they would then have the opportunity to choose which voice they listen to. Sometimes we are given the privilege to know that we have heard God's voice, clear and loud in our ears. But even then, we still have a choice to make. We don't have to listen to God. We can continue to live neatly and safely in our own little boxes. But what if we chose to listen to that voice, the voice of life? What if we actually chose to listen to Jesus? Whose voice? On this day, in this time, whose voice will we listen to?